Welcome to week 2 of Intro to Game Development. Dr. Phelan, and today we're going to cover chapters 3 and 4 in the reading. We're going to be talking about the layered tetrad and some associated topics. So, the layered tetrad builds off of Shell's elemental tetrad with its 4 different aspects: the aesthetics, mechanics, narrative, and technology of the game. But it extends this into a 3-dimensional kind of concept where we have first the inscribed layer. This is the static layer that the game designers and developers create, their vision for the game, how it's implemented by the coders. It's everything that they kind of put into paper and put into the code to say, this is what the game is, this is how the game behaves, this is how the game looks. And so it's this set inscribed layer set in stone of how they want that game to look and feel and behave. But then we have a second layer, which is created according to the theory of the layered tetrad. This is created when players interact with the game, this dynamic layer, where the mechanics, narrative, technology, and aesthetics suddenly take on a not a life of their own, but a different variation based on the player's interaction with them. So, two different people may interact with the same game in a way that shifts the way that the game behaves or feels or is perceived by players. And then finally, we have this broader conversation, this socio layer or socio-cultural layer, where society looks at the game from the outside, how the game is perceived by society at large, how is the game butting heads with social norms, how does it affect players' health and well-being, how does it affect society at large. A really great example of this is the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game. So when it was created, there was this how it was going to be played. Players adapted it in different ways, and then society has perceived it differently as time has gone on, and those perceptions shift. So this becomes really important to you as a game designer because you have to start asking questions about unintended consequences. When you create a game, the book gives the example of the Team Fortress 2 hat drop and the unintended consequences of that you can read about. But basically, as a designer, whenever you create a game and you expect players to interact with it in a certain way, once you define the objectives, you lose control over what's going to actually happen. The players may look for ways to circumvent the rules to meet the objectives, or may come up with their own objectives for how they want the game to progress. And so, one of the things that the book points out, and I think this is pretty important, is that the 3 layers of that layer tetrad model represent a transition of ownership. So, the inscribed layer starts out with the developers and designers of the game owning how the game looks and feels and behaves. But then, once it's released, the next layer transitions to the players owning that aspect. And then, once the game becomes popular, becomes known by society at large, then suddenly we have society talking about that game, talking about exactly what is the perception of that game. Is the game promoting good things or bad things? Is it having a positive or negative effect on society? And so we have this transfer of ownership. And so you have to ask as a designer, at what point does your responsibility end? Is your responsibility done at the inscribed layer? Do you have a responsibility for making sure that players do not uh, take the game in a direction that is not intended? Do you have a responsibility to answer to society once a game becomes popular? So these are all questions that don't really have black and white answers, but we have just things to think about as designers. So, to go a little more in depth this week with the inscribed layer, so we have 4 aspects in all of these layers, and in the inscribed layer, we have aesthetics, mechanics, narrative, and technology. These are the things that the designers and the developers use to create the essential elements of the game. So, the mechanics of the game, as the book talks about it, is how the game works, how what the rules are, what the interactions are. We have the aesthetics, which is how the game looks and feels and sounds, the overall just general feeling and emotional evocation that the game provides. And then we have the storyline behind the game that can either be very basic. In Super Mario Brothers, the storyline's pretty basic. we've got this plumber who somehow is in the Mushroom Kingdom, is going to rescue the princess from Bowser. And over the years, that narrative has expanded until we have a full, 2.5 hour or 2 hour long movie about that. Um, and so that narrative can be simple or extremely complex. And then we have the underlying technology. What makes the game behave? How is it created? So, for example, come back to the Dungeons and Dragons example. It's a paper and dice based role playing game at its core, but over the years, people have created different technological adaptations to it to make it more interactive, or to provide miniatures, or to um, allow people to use their phones or tablets to interact with the game and interact with other players, or to track stats, etc. And so the technology, everything else about the game can be the same, but the underlying technology can change, allowing it to have a different feel. Trine is another good example of this. The Trine game, the aesthetics were tied to the technology. And when Trine 2 came out, they created a new game engine for it. And then they went back and re released Trine 1 using the new engine. And that shift in technology caused a change in aesthetics, even though the mechanics and narratives stayed the same. So the technology can definitely have a huge impact on the way the game is perceived. So, just to provide some other examples of games that kind of do a great job in each of these areas, Prince of Persia, pretty light on storyline. You're a prince in Persia. The princess has been captured by some bad guy. And I'm sure there's more in depth narrative than that, but that's basically the feel. You're in a castle. You have to find a sword and rescue the princess. But what really sets this game apart are the mechanics. At the time, the interaction was pretty fluid. The things that the player could do and the way that the player could interact with their environment was pretty cutting edge for that era. Flashback is another game. I think this released for Super Nintendo. The interactions had a great storyline as well, but the interactions with the player and the environment, the things they could do, really set this game apart for the time period. In the aesthetics department, Myst is the canonical example of a game that really pushed the boundaries of what was possible at the time. One of the first, at least the first popular CD-ROM based game, which took advantage of that extra storage space to have some really beautiful visualizations and some immersive atmospheric music and things that were associated with the game. Also, a pretty compelling storyline that kept people very engaged and spawned a number of remakes and sequels to the series. Another example of a game with a great narrative is the Final Fantasy series, particularly Final Fantasy 1 in the US version of Final Fantasy 1. This game had a pretty compelling storyline, pretty in depth things that were going on, a lot of complexity for that time period for a role playing game, but very popular, also spawned a ton of sequels. Another example of a game with a really interesting narrative is Zelda, of course, the Zelda series. It had such a complex narrative that when the Hyrule Historia book came out, they had to retcon how all the games fit together into the different timelines, and why is Link keep showing up in different forms and in different ages, and how does that all fit together? And so, pretty interesting retconning of that timeline, but very complex narrative that continues to resonate with people today. So the key concept here, the layered tetrad, this transfer of ownership from developers to players, to the community slash society, and what is the responsibility of the designer and developer throughout that journey? How can you prevent unintended consequences while also allowing the game to be interesting? So one other thing the book talks about that I want to bring up here, because I think it's important as designers to think about this when we think about unintended consequences, is the idea of side quests. The book talks about this in the context of Skyrim, but I want to talk about it in the context of Breath of the Wild. So you have this overarching storyline in both examples, this critical thing that's happening in the world that your protagonist needs to do something about. But in the case of Breath of the Wild, since it's an open world game, you can also completely ignore that mainline quest and just go around exploring and seeing all these different shrines and collecting spirit orbs and Deku seeds and all these other things. So you've got this mainline quest that supposedly the entire fate of the known world hinges upon you resolving, but you can postpone it for as long as you want and just kind of go on a sightseeing adventure. So, how does that affect the narrative? Some people really enjoy this aspect of Breath of the Wild, But to other people, it's kind of a flaw in the design that you can have this open world aspect, but the world is not affected by your choices in that way. There are kind of micro choices that affect things, like different shrines being opened up, accessing different towers, things like that. The way some characters are affected by completing a side quest, but nothing you do really affects the urgency of the overall quest. You can just let those divine beasts continue to run rampant for as long as you want, and nothing happens. So, just something to think about as a designer. The unintended consequences of declaring a mainline quest has no real urgency. How does that affect the design, and are you okay with that? So that's everything we're going to talk about this week. As always, if you have any questions or comments, share them on Slack or send me an email.